the term paper assignments, they say 10% or 5% or something. Does that mean we're gonna get like a commute, blah, 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 like a grade that's a cumulative? I can't say the word. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Cumulative. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know why I can't say it, but yeah.
No, it's everyone has one of those words. So how it works is if you add up all the percentages together, they add together into 100%. So think of what you just received as, so this assignment was 10%, right? So if you lost, say, 5 points, say that it shows up in Blackboard as a 50%, what that actually means is you lost 5 points off of that final percentage, meaning that you're actually, assuming you get 100% on everything else, at 95%. So the grades here can look a lot more staggering than they actually are. So if I grade it a little bit more harshly, that is why, because those points, I mean, it's the equivalent of losing just 5 points off an assignment. Now, if you continually do that, so I took off more points if there was clearly something that needed to be addressed and you just didn't address it. So the idea is if you fix that, if you kind of improve for the future, then it's just going to be a drop in the bucket in the long term. The point is just stay on target, keep doing these, and get everything in on time, get everything complete, and you'll still be fine. If you didn't get if anyone didn't get a grade that they didn't really want, there's plenty of room to come back from that, I assure you. Hey, Jasenia. Hey, Monia. Okay. Other questions, comments about the term paper assignment? I mentioned that you have 3 weeks until the next one is due, but I hope you realize just how much effort it can take to string together 3 of these summaries. So imagine doing double that plus 1 more. Make sure that you schedule out time a little bit each week in the next 3 weeks to find some articles, to summarize them, spend some time, chew on them, think about them. Remember what the point of this term paper is. It's to learn something. It's to dive deeply into a topic that hopefully you're genuinely interested in, that you want an answer to, and that you wouldn't mind having an entire term paper written about. I mean, I think this is a great opportunity, again, especially for anyone who's interested in doing something like an independent research project, who might need to use these skills, this information for doing that in your future career. So keep that in mind. Put a little effort into this. Make it something that you're proud of. Make it something that's interesting to read, that I'm going to want to read. At this point, it feels like you're just stringing together a bunch of summaries. But eventually what's going to happen is, as you put together 10 of these summaries, you're just going to magically get like 6 or 7 pages of a really solid, informative introduction. That's what we're going for. At the very end of this, you're going to have the vast majority of your term paper written already, and it's going to feel really good. But you got to put in that time and make sure you do that. All right? All right, cool. If no other questions about that, I want to dive right into it. I assume that this chapter will probably have a bit more to talk about, some good discussion questions. So who wants to open it up? We could talk about anything: fertility, birth control, any type of birth control. I realized that this week we didn't go over hormonal birth control. However, I am happy to talk about that because I'm hoping that next week we're going to concentrate a lot on abortion. So whatever you guys want to talk about.
Does birth control affect like fertility in women in the long term?
Good question. Fertility, no. Very broadly speaking. So your hormonal birth control, which is what I'm assuming you're kind of referring to. No, you said hormonal birth control, right?
Yes.
Not like
Yes. Like,
yeah.
like the pill. Yeah.
Yeah. So for most people, and this is the vast majority of people, I mean, if there are cases of this, it is very, very rare. And there's probably some other underlying condition that the birth control might be making worse, rather than the birth control itself causing an issue. But no, it does not tend to cause long-term fertility problems. How birth control generally works is you're going to be making kind of short-term changes to how the menstrual cycle works. And we'll get into the details of exactly how that works next week, but you're making some short-term changes, and all you're really doing is you're continually making those short-term changes. That's why you need to keep taking birth control pills throughout the month. Every single day, you pretty much have to take one, unless you're using, there are some types that you can use more infrequently, but most, at least pills that you take, you have to take every day. And anyone who takes pills, you realize that if you miss a day, if you miss a couple of days, that can actually highly reduce the effectiveness of those birth control pills. So it's really like you're just continually taking this short-term solution to make sure that you don't get pregnant. So once you stop using them, everything just goes right back to normal. What the body does is whatever. So essentially, with birth control pills, you are introducing hormones that are not native to the body. For example, you might introduce progesterone or estrogen in certain amounts, but it's not the normal amount that you would make. So you're putting extra in there to accomplish something. Again, we'll talk about it in more detail soon. But as soon as you stop taking that, then your body just goes back to making the normal amount of hormone and having the regular fluctuation in the cycle, where during that follicular phase, you build up to ovulation. After ovulation, your body starts to prepare for pregnancy. If you don't get pregnant, then all that endometrium gets sloughed off and you have your period, and then everything starts all over again. You go right back into that. So yeah, no long-term effects in terms of fertility. However, there are other, there can be health effects. So for example, if you take birth control and you take it, I believe the estimate, last time I checked into this, the estimate was about 4 years. If you're taking birth control pills for about 4 years, you're pretty good. But after that, the chances of getting blood clots, of having circulatory issues, that tends to go up. So a lot of doctors will recommend that if you're on birth control, you shouldn't be on it forever, or that you should take it for a while, then you should not be taking it for a while, and then maybe try something else. So that can be an issue. And the other thing we'll talk about is that although there are some health side effects, but there are also a lot of psychological side effects that have historically been understudied. Because they're not directly related to physical health, which is usually what, the Food and Drug Administration, they really care about that stuff. The psychological effects, not so much, but there are psychological effects in some individuals, and depending on the type that you take. For example, the stuff that really pumps you full of progesterone, like Depo-Provera, or usually pretty much any type of hormonal birth control where you do something and then you can just forget about it for a while. A lot of that is progesterone based, and people tend to report experiencing a lot of side effects from that stuff, which we can talk about if you want.
I have a follow-up question to that first question about the infertility. So what about, I have heard a rumor, I don't know if this is true, but does taking a lot of Plan Bs affect fertility?
That's a good question. If you abuse it to such a degree. So how Plan B works is, well, so there are a few types of Plan B. And the one that is probably most common is one that essentially floods your system with progesterone. It gives you a lot of it. Essentially, you're trying to trick your body into thinking that it is pregnant very, very quickly. So that the embryo, if it's there, if say sperm and egg have met, it can't implant into the uterus. Or if it's already there, there's actually another mechanism whereby it'll attempt to induce menstruation early, so that if it is implanted, then it'll get rid of what's implanted. I don't know an exact answer to if you just kept taking Plan B over and over and over again, whether that would cause infertility. That's a really good question. I don't have a solid answer to that. However, Plan B is, I mean, it's what it sounds like. It should be Plan B. It's very harsh on your body often. And so if you continually use that over and over again, I'm not sure if it's going to affect your fertility, but almost guaranteed you're not going to be having a good time. You're probably going to be, every time you take Plan B, probably having some fairly large, say, mood swings, possibly menstrual cramps, because especially if you're taking the type that causes, kind of induces the uterus to contract, you might be having that kind of pain. You can get sick. I mean, Plan B is really harsh on you. I mean, it's like the chemical treatment for unplanned pregnancy. So I would be very hesitant to use Plan B in general. But of course, if you have to, I mean, it's not gonna harm you to take it once or twice within a long period of time. I wouldn't use it as a regular form of birth control, though. No. Whether it causes infertility, I actually don't know the answer to that. I'll try to look that up and get back to you.
Thank you.
All right, other questions. Just throw them out. Let's use this time as wisely as we can.
Do you know like who decided to like track their menstrual cycle? Like how I know there's like many generations before me, but like who like decided, oh, like there's blood coming out of somebody's, let's track the period of time and how many times it like comes out a year.
Like the almost ancient history of doing that.
Yeah.
I don't know who, say, the historical figures of doing that kind of research. I mean, William and Johnson, who are a fairly famous duo of sex researchers, kind of back in the 40s, 50s, etc. They, I think, are credited with starting a lot of the modern practices of researching various kinds of sexual behavior. They were really the first ones to really take a biological approach to studying sexuality. Not that they were the first, but that they were the most prolific. They ended up getting the right kind of grant money. They founded an institution. They actually, did the boots on the ground kind of dirty work for that. So they're very famous for that. And I believe that a lot of their work involved recording menstrual cycles as well. But in terms of before that, I think that we lived, especially in the Western world, in such sexuality was so taboo, and certainly women's health was not something that I think was at the top of most public institutions' list of priorities. That it really wasn't something that was formally studied till the last century or so. Again, just kind of women getting the short end of the stick there, as usual. Just not being the focus of study. Ancient studies, though, I mean, people have been interested in fertility for a very long time, and I think for very clear reasons. Some people wanted to have babies, and so they would figure out and try to estimate every possible way to increase the chance of someone getting pregnant or for themselves getting pregnant. Or on the opposite side, people have had many different types of hormonal not just hormonal, but just regular birth control, any kind of contraception for since ancient times. We actually have evidence, I forget if I mentioned this in some of my lectures, but we actually have evidence that there are some non-human species that seem to have figured out that they can eat certain types of plants and herbs as birth control to induce abortion. Now, when we talk about non-humans, it's very difficult to say whether they do this intentionally, but they at least seem to do it multiple times. That is, they've done it once, they do it again, and it's not part of their daily or their natural feeding pattern. And so they seem to be using these plants possibly to either, usually it's to induce an abortion. It's to induce a miscarriage, that once that individual is already pregnant, then they get rid of that developing embryo. So it's been around a while. People have been interested in fertility for a while, but I don't think people really understood how the menstrual cycle worked. In fact, I know that you bring this up, I was actually at a conference once listening to some research done in some non-Western societies, especially in, where exactly was this? These were in kind of historically hunter-gatherer societies, which are not industrialized. That is, they don't have kind of many modern advances that you would see in again, more westernized, industrialized, educated, usually white societies. In these societies, what they actually had certain fertility rituals that said that to get a woman pregnant, what you should do is you should actually have sex with her right after her period ends. Now that's kind of getting close to it, but actually, if you want that ideal window, it's actually about a week after a woman's period ends, usually a little bit longer than that, because a period doesn't last exactly a week. Usually it's usually say 3 to 5 days. And so I think what people were doing is they were just doing really good guesswork, is that they would, as a frame of reference, they might realize, while an individual is bleeding, they may not be able to get pregnant. But then as soon as they stop, then try to have sex with your partner as much as possible, and then hopefully you'll get pregnant. Now, it's imperfect, but it was good enough, because usually sperm lasts a little while in the reproductive tract. So if you have sex with an individual, say, if you have sex a week beforehand, it's possible, and you have sex several times across, say, the period of a week, eventually you're probably going to get your partner pregnant. But they didn't really understand that, ovulation occurs in this particular window, and the egg is released within that 72-hour window. People just couldn't know that. We're talking about, again, microscopic events here, eggs being released and traveling through a tube that, for most of human history, we could not see. So we did a lot of guesswork, but people are really interested in it, but we really didn't understand a lot about the menstrual cycle until relatively recently. Yeah. Yeah, as far as the ancient history, I'm not sure, though. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, sir.
So I have a question for you guys. Do you feel like by learning about the menstrual cycle, or how birth control relates, or learning about fertility, learning how sperm egg meets, the time frame that it takes to actually for that thing to travel to the uterus, say when pregnancy tests actually start to become effective, has anyone found this extremely useful, or has changed how they think about their sexual health or whatnot?
Me, it definitely has, and I say that because you kind of get all the technicals without actually, because before this class, of course, we all have our own experience, but seeing the technicals and seeing, how it actually works, yes, it's like a big difference, because it's just like things that you didn't know. If you didn't know, then we're going over them. So it's been interesting, and it's been good at the same time. I've been enjoying it personally.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, I feel like when it comes to pregnancy and fertility and the menstrual cycle and all that not knowing about that stuff can cause so much anxiety. Because what it does, I think, is when you don't really understand how all of that works, you might have sex, and instead of focusing on sex for its pleasurable aspects, or for the bonding that you can feel with a person, instead the whole time you might just be worrying, oh my God, am I going to get pregnant? Is something bad going to happen? Is X, Y, and Z? And I think to really understand how all that works is to alleviate that stress, is to give you much more power, and I think in a lot of cases, an ability to relax, and be much more comfortable with sex in a way. Yeah, okay. I'm glad to hear that. Anyone else have kind of impressions of how this has helped, if it has helped?
I feel like if I were to get in a situation where someone could be pregnant, I wouldn't be as worried because I just feel like it's not as likely to happen as I used to think it is, if that makes sense.
True. Yeah. So there's kind of this little window where it can happen. I will say though, we're most motivated to have sex at around that time when someone's likely to get pregnant. So I don't know if anyone has ever tried to download a fertility app or an app for your phone to track your menstrual cycle. If you have not, I highly recommend it. That is, again, you can kind of track if you take, so with a person's menstrual cycle, it's, I mean, how regular your cycle is can depend on a lot of things. First off, who you are, and then what's going on that month, you know, how much stress you're experiencing, whether you've been sick a lot, etc. So when you start using these fertility apps, at first they're going to be really, really unreliable. But if you get good at it and if you get consistent about it and you track your cycle every single month, say for up to a year, what you've done is now you've gathered data points, 12 different data points, one data point each month. And now even if your cycle is a little bit, if your cycle is a little bit inconsistent, over time with all those data points, you're going to get, your app is actually going to be able to predict with really good accuracy when you're ovulating or when you're likely to get your period or when some other event is happening across the menstrual cycle. And that again can help you make informed decisions about when it's safest to have sex, what kind of precaution you should take. It might help explain, say, why you feel a certain way on a particular day. It's a lot of people do it now, and I think it's a godsend for a lot of people just to understand that about their own sexual health. So if you haven't done it, I recommend it. There are tons. I have a list of them in next week's lecture, I believe, but I don't know. Does anyone have a fertility app they use that they want to share about? I'm sure the technology is constantly changing.
I use Life. That's the name of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're all usually like one word, really powerful like names for these apps.
Yeah, it has like a calendar where it's like whenever it's about like that time of the month, it has like red lines through them. And then that's really what I track. I don't really track fertility because I don't have to deal with that.
Right. All right, cool. Well, let's more questions. So how do we all feel about understanding how the fertility chapter, all I really wanted you to know from that chapter was how once sperm and egg meet, they ultimately migrate and it ends up implanting into the uterus. And there is a process there. It takes a number of days for it to reach the uterus. Once it's there and it implants, it has to create a certain type of hormone. Any questions about that whole process? Anything there that didn't make sense or you felt a little unsure about? Again, I will be asking about this process on the midterm.
What did you say again? Sorry.
Just any questions about that first part of the fertility chapter, where it's describing how sperm and egg migrate through the fallopian tube and ultimately and implant into the uterus. Any questions about that whole process? How a pregnancy is maintained?
I don't have a question about that, but I do have like a random question.
Shoot.
So you know how like breast milk is like formed during pregnancy and like all of that? Can breast milk like be formed without even being pregnant? Can like something within your breast like still produce milk? Can men produce milk? Because that would be crazy. Like
So
yeah.
yeah, so yes to the first question, that you can produce milk even though you're not pregnant, because it's not the pregnancy itself that causes milk production. It's the various hormones that are released, especially, so there are two that are really responsible for what's called milk letdown. There's oxytocin, which gets released, I mean, at many different parts of the day. Oxytocin is kind of a bonding chemical, and women will actually make it pretty consistently throughout pregnancy for the purposes of milk letdown. The other one is called prolactin, which kind of makes sense. Pro means in favor of or stimulating, and lactation refers to the production of milk, the letdown of milk. So prolactin is a hormone that's specific to that. Now, prolactin is usually only produced in large enough amounts when you're pregnant. However, if for one reason or another you have more prolactin in your system, even if you're not pregnant, that could lead to milk production. I'm trying to think of circumstances where that would happen. I think that there are certain physiological conditions. I'm trying to think about medications. I don't think very many medications would affect that, but I think prolactin can be taken as a supplement for certain types of health issues or kind of chronic health issues. So yes, that can happen. However, for milk to be produced, it's not just a matter of do you have the hormone or not. The hormone has to act on something. So the hormone has to interact with the tissue that's present in the breast tissue, in the mammary glands. So for men typically cannot, and I say men as those who have physiological or morphological body traits that typically resemble men, are not going to be able to usually produce milk, because those who have predominantly male typical characteristics tend not to develop that breast tissue. However, pretty much anyone can develop breast tissue under the right circumstances. So if that breast tissue is present, then you are likely to, if again you're exposed to prolactin, that can cause that tissue to begin to produce milk, and then for it to be lactated, for it to come out of the nipples under the right circumstances. Men, though, as a general category, will not produce milk because they typically don't develop the right kind of breast tissue. They don't develop those cavities where the milk is produced, and then the smooth muscle that forms around those cavities to press the milk out. So unless you have those structures, you're not producing it, and you're not going to be able to actually have it be ejected. So there are two things that you need. You need the right equipment, and you need the right hormones that actually stimulate the production of the milk. If those things are true, then yes, you could produce milk. If those things are not true, then no. Good question, by the way. Other questions? I'm happy to talk about birth control as well. We can talk about barrier methods. I hope everyone took away a good lesson on how to use condoms appropriately from the lecture. A lot of people, I've had so many students, and this is much more fun to watch in person when I can actually see people's faces. But I once told a student that to put a condom on properly, they actually had to pinch that tip first and then roll it onto the penis. Because that little reservoir at the end, if it still has air in it, that increases the chance that it can break. And I remember I told this to a class once, and I had one student look at me, just her jaw dropped, and she was like, "What?" I think surprise and probably a little bit of stress that she hadn't been doing that for throughout her life. Any reactions or questions about the contraception section?
What is the like specific hormone that increases sexual like tendencies, like wanting to have intercourse?
The thorough answer is that there are a lot of hormones that contribute to that. However, we do know that of the hormones that we've learned so far, of the different sex hormones, that is progesterone, estrogen, testosterone is a big one. And this is in part why, so what testosterone does is it's not necessarily going to make you hornier or more interested in sex. It will do that to some degree. But especially what it'll do is it might motivate you to seek out sexual opportunities more. So it's not so much, oh, I'm feeling really horny, I want to have sex right now. It's more of, you may feel horny. Testosterone is going to contribute to the degree to which you look around and you go, okay, what opportunities do I have right now to act on these sexual urges? When we talk about sex differences, which we'll talk about, when we talk about sex and gender differences between men and women predominantly, we'll talk about how men do tend to have a greater interest in sexual variety. So there's this myth that men and women are different in sex drive. That tends not to be the case. Both men and women get horny. They want sex. They are interested in it, and they're willing to seek it out under the right circumstances. The real difference for men and women tends to be how much stress, how much anxiety, how much is in the way of especially women pursuing that sex drive. So it's less about just that, not having it in the first place. It's more of, there are a lot of other barriers. Women have to, again, worry about, if they get pregnant, they're going to be pregnant for 9 months. That is going to lead to changes in her body, not just in the long term, but even throughout the pregnancy, and kind of the kind of stress that can come along with that. So I think especially people who are very aware of that you can get pregnant from having sex, and that it's going to be this long ordeal, and that you'll have a child that you'll at least have to take care of for 9 months, if not usually longer, it can get in the way of expressing that. So men and women do differ on testosterone, and they don't differ in sex drive, but they will tend to differ in how often they seek out sexual variety. That is, how many different partners do you want to have sex with? Men tend to seek out sexual variety more, and that seems to be related to testosterone. Overall, what I would say, though, is if you're trying to think about what affects sex drive, you can't really look too much at hormones alone. I think a lot of people focus on hormones because they think, oh man, my sex drive feels like this really physiological, this biological thing that kind of drives me to seek out sex, and you think, oh man, it must be the hormones. Hormones do contribute, absolutely. But again, there are so many other circumstantial factors that influence your not only how horny you feel in a given moment, but whether you're willing to seek out sex. And I think you really had to focus on those. Again, for both men and women, the more stressed you feel, that is, we could talk about another hormone, which I haven't really talked about much in this class, called cortisol. That contributes to the experiences of stress. For both men and women, the more stressed you are, typically the lower your sex drive is going to be. It's not that cortisol is a sex hormone. It doesn't directly, it's not there to act on your sex drive. But what stress tells you is, I have other stuff that I need to concentrate on right now. I have to write an essay. I have to take care of a family member. I have to, I just lost someone who's very important to me. In those moments, your body is going to prioritize other things. It's going to prioritize getting those stressful tasks done, versus you're not going to prioritize having sex in that moment. Sex is almost more of it is a primary motivation, which is as much as hunger and thirst is, but it's something that your body will say, okay, we can do that later. And so if you're habitually stressed, which I think most people within the modern world feel, that there's always something to do, there's always something to worry about. Habitually feeling stressed can lower your sex drive. So that's not so much a hormonal cause. Sounds good, thanks, Gazelle. That's not so much a hormonal cause as much as this is an environmental cause. There are things out here that are stressing you out that then directly impact your sex drive. So that's me going on a tangent again. Testosterone's a big one. Other hormones, estrogen does contribute to sex drive, not as directly as testosterone, but it does, especially for women. But then you really have to think about a lot of other contextual factors, like how stressed you are, etc. Yeah. Sex drive is a funny thing. I'll say this. One thing we do know about the difference between, again, men and women is that for a man to become aroused and to be willing to have sex is usually much easier than it is for a woman to experience the same thing. Women's sex drives tend to, a great graphic, I should find this, I think it would take me too long to find though, is imagine kind of two sets of switches. Men's sex drive is often seen as this kind of like, okay, there's one switch. If you turn it on, he's aroused and he's ready to go. Versus, another image for women, there are many different switches that have to be hit in the correct order under the right set of circumstances in order to lead to sexual arousal. So what we do know is that for women, it tends to be a much more, it requires a bit more. And typically before sex, just even getting into sex in the first place, there might need to be much more foreplay, much more kind of like, romancing and kind of, doing less kind of direct physical acts of sex, kind of leading up to it, oral sex, touching, etc. That then leads into the, say, penetrative sex or what I think men are much more usually willing to just jump straight into. So that's another difference that we tend to observe, is that for women, sex drive tends to be a much more complicated, context dependent, that it's dependent on the situation and a number of different factors. It's not just, are you taking the right medication that's going to get you horny. I think there are a lot of medications on the market for men to increase men's sex drive. Not so many on the market for women. In part, again, women tend to receive the shorter end of the stick. They've historically not had as much research on their sex drive. But the other thing is there's really just no drug that you can give to a woman that ends up just making her horny. It's, again, much more complicated than that usually for women. Much usually to the frustration of women themselves.
So I know that there's pills out there. Also found out that there's chocolate out there. That's crazy too. But would a female, I know there are pills for females, but I know there is a more wide variety of pills for males. Would a female be able to take a male's pill and still get this, not same exact reaction, but kind of like a reaction in a similar way?
Yeah, actually, before I answer that, I want to say it's just for the sake of clarity, what I would say is rather than females and males, because female and male refers more to, if you're referring to especially non-human animals, you call them male and female something. It's kind of it's an adjective, right? A male something versus a female something. If you're referring just to individuals, I would just use men and women. Just my advice. In terms of your question, though, sorry, could you repeat that question again? I kind of missed the last part of that.
Would a now you got me all messed up now.
I apologize.
With and what is it? A sexually enhancing pill, would both genders be able to take the pill and still get the same reaction?
They probably would not get the same reaction. So again, they're usually formulated for men and women differently. So Again, for men, it's much more direct. It's much easier usually. There are pills on the market for women, but what you're usually going to see is it may have some effectiveness. That is, for some women, it tends to work reliably. And if you just happen to be one of those types, that the person for which it works, then it works great. But as a generic pill that works for most women everywhere, not so much. Things like, so historically they've looked at things like chocolate and oysters and I want to say ginseng, I think, are all considered, those are called aphrodisiacs. These are foods or drugs or chemicals, usually foods, that presumably increase your sex drive. Now, for a long time, we didn't have really good science to disconfirm and say, no, chocolate doesn't increase your sex drive. But actually, there have been studies that have come out recently actually doing double-blind, experimentally controlled designs. That is, you're actually dividing people up into different experimental groups where you give some people the chocolate, you give other people no chocolate, you follow them over time, see how their sex drive changes. And it turns out chocolate is not an aphrodisiac. So chocolate is not going to increase your sex drive. Same oysters. Oysters, I believe, were somewhere kind of in the middle where it was not clear. There was not a clear link between eating oysters and having a higher sex drive. Now, ginseng, I want to say it was ginseng. So it's possible that I need to correct myself here. I believe it was ginseng. They're actually, that does seem to be an aphrodisiac. So ginseng seems to be something that it doesn't increase it a lot. It's not like you take ginseng and all of a sudden you're fiery, hot, and red. But it might just kind of push you in that direction a little bit. I believe there's some evidence for that. That's what I've seen. Now, all that said, that doesn't mean that, say, receiving chocolate would not put you in the mood in other ways. For example, when we usually receive chocolate, probably around Valentine's Day or around a holiday, when you're probably, maybe you have off from work, maybe you're being, your partner's trying to woo you, it's actually spending time on you. In those circumstances, it may not be the chocolate that makes you aroused, but rather the fact that you are in a holiday season where you don't have to worry about stuff as much, you're more relaxed, you're less stressed. Your partner is saying, I love you and I appreciate you, and I did this thing for you to show you that I love you and I appreciate you. Those are probably the factors that are going to lead to you being more interested in sex. You're relaxed, you're happy, etc. I think that's what people usually get confused with this. It's not a chemical reaction that's causing higher sex drive. It's all these other factors related to when you would receive chocolate, most likely. Yeah, Monietta, do you have a question? Your mic's open.
I am so sorry. I did not mean to open it.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. When it comes to these kinds of supplements, these sexually enhancing supplements, unless it's something like Viagra, where there's actually a very specific physiological basis for how Viagra causes what it causes, I'd be very careful. And I would think about what other variables might be responsible for why I'm feeling the way that I am. For example, with chocolate, that we tend to receive chocolate around times in which we're more relaxed. So there may be something else explaining the higher sex drive and not the thing that you're taking. But there are drugs, they are developing drugs. I haven't kept super up to date on the different kinds of sexual enhancement drugs that are made for women. I know they exist. I just don't know. I don't know how effective they are, and I would be skeptical that they'd be extremely effective, just given the differences, especially between men and women, in what it takes to kind of be sexually aroused and then to be comfortable with having sex. All right. Other questions about the chapter readings or about the lectures? Okay. Let's I want to talk about the Rigetti article. Ooh. I guess I got to keep that up there. Let me see if I can share this real quick. What were your impressions of the Rigetti article? Just to remind you, this is the article we're talking about. What this study did was it actually recruited couples, and then they recorded hormonal fluctuations, specifically of the woman. Although, did they look at participants collected daily urine samples? Yeah, they actually collected hormonal samples from both the men and the women. And so they were able to compare not just how women's hormones fluctuate across, say, the menstrual cycle across a month, but also how men's hormones fluctuate in response. And I think that that's something that we don't give a lot of credit towards, is that men also have hormonal fluctuations. It's not tied to a menstrual cycle, but that fluctuation does exist. And then they examined how these fluctuations influence various aspects of relationship quality. So any reactions to this article or questions? Don't make me start calling on people. Yeah, just say.
Don't even say that. That's a threat, man.
I know. I don't like doing it. It's harsh. It's rude, but we got to keep it lively.
So, like, my term paper is kind of about not exactly hormonal changes, but kind of sexual urgencies, things that people kind of let's say crave. So what would be the effects of someone repeatedly building up that urgency, but then not releasing, let's say, that pressure? Because I know dudes do it. I've heard blue balls, and I don't really know about females and stuff like that when it comes to that situation.
So yeah, there are a lot of terms for that. There's blue balls, where you kind of get excited and then nothing happens from it. There's something called edging, which people do, where they might masturbate, they get up to that edge, but they don't quite orgasm, and they just kind of either stay there or they let it kind of go. In terms of if you're wondering about long-term health consequences, there tend not to be long-term health consequences to doing that, at least for most people. Now, we got to look at men and women separately here, just because, again, when we're looking at, say, sexual organs, and we're talking about the internal reproductive tract and what sexual arousal does to men versus women, there are differences, right? And so for men, what's going to happen is, for men, remember that sperm is stored in the vas deferens. It's there, it's ready to be ejaculated. And so what doing that might cause is that sperm might start to be kind of pushed forward to be ready to be ejaculated, or the bulbourethral gland and the prostate will start producing that alkaline chemical, that fluid that's meant to neutralize the acidity. So when you are, say, masturbating, or you're feeling that sexual urgency, and then you just kind of you feel it, it gets to a crescendo, it gets to the top, and then you kind of let it go. What might be happening for men there is that you're actually kind of getting everything in place, and then nothing actually happens. You don't ejaculate. So I think the experience of blue balls tends to be that the sperm is there, it's kind of pushed forward, it's like everything's at the gate, it's like an army just ready to like rush out once the doors open, and then nothing happens. And so a little bit of pain, I think, can be experienced when, for example, those muscles that are kind of around the vas deferens that are pushing that sperm up, they get a really good workout. They're kind of pushing everything forward. They're contracting a lot. And then nothing happens, they get no release. So there's been a lot of muscle contraction. That those muscles might start to get tired, they might start to get cramped. And furthermore, you're pushing you're pushing tons of sperm up into the vas deferens and creating pressure there. So I think when a guy tends to feel that, experience that, or anyone with a penis experiences that, then you might be experiencing some of those physiological consequences, those kind of pain in the muscle, pain in kind of from things being set up but never quite released. For women, you can have something like that, because when women get aroused, the vulva, the clitoris, anywhere where there's blood vessels that can be engorged with blood, and that during sexual stimulation, the corpus cavernosa, the corpus spongiosum, the different parts of the clitoris, they actually get engorged with blood. And so you can keep blood there for a while if, say, you're aroused and then you don't really feel any release from it. I am not sure if there's something equivalent to blue balls in women. That's a really good question. I just think by virtue of how everything is set up, for women, there's not so much these kind of muscle contractions, getting things to move in a certain direction, like there is for men and sperm through the vas deferens and all that. So for women, I don't think there's really that necessarily physical pain that can come from it, or physical exhaustion, but you are storing blood in there for a while, and you are kind of engaging that tissue. So that tissue can potentially feel extra sensitive or tired afterwards if nothing happens of it. So from a physical stance, I hope that answers your question, but was your question kind of bigger about, say, like the psychological consequences, or I don't know, how did that, does that help?
Yeah, you gave more of like a internal explanation, and I understood it.
Okay. Yeah, it's I actually, so people are, if you get into certain kind of sexual communities, kink communities, things like that, there are communities that are actually dedicated to, we're gonna really get into the weeds here, but why not? Things like orgasm control, where rather than just kind of having sex, releasing orgasm, and then it's over, it's more of a, can you not experience that release and thereby extend that experience of feeling aroused and potentially of having sexual interaction with your partner? There are some people who do that, and that seems to be perfectly healthy. Those kinds of communities have existed for a very long time. They've done research on those communities and doing things like orgasm denial, although if it's done in an abusive way, that's certainly never good. But in terms of just as a sexual practice, it seems to not cause long-term physical health, or it's not like something's going to rupture and then it's going to be a problem. That can be done safely. Just FYI.
This might be a little bit too much. I don't really know.
It's never too much.
But I've heard, like, let's say you are masturbating, right? And you stop right before climax, and you like wait a couple minutes and you do it again, and it's like more of a like explosive reaction. Like, could that happen with like males? Because I don't have a penis, so I don't really know.
Yeah. I will say that Oh man, there's a very deep literature about whether men's and women's orgasms tend to actually be different and whether they experience it differently. I'll say this, there seem to be two camps here. There seem to be the really hardline scientists who just haven't figured it out, which I think is what my experience, my interpretation of it is. But if you, I just think, ask people in their daily experiences, there do tend to be, men tend to have a fairly stereotypical, fairly consistent, I say that for those people who have not really explored their bodies a lot, those who have, men I think who have orgasms tend to experience one type of orgasm, largely, especially if it's a orgasm stimulated through the penis. Versus women, what really stimulates an orgasm for a woman is usually going to be, again, it's always much more complicated. It's not just direct stimulation of, say, the clitoris. There's usually also, there's an orgasm that many women report a feeling from that, but then there can also be kind of a deeper internal kind of full body orgasm, which can be stimulated by kind of internal pressure usually. We talked a little bit about the G-spot before. Some people report that for those who can kind of find the G-spot and get it to work for them, they can experience that kind of very much kind of full body orgasm rather than this kind of localized clitoral orgasm. Some people distinguish between those two things. Whether starting to masturbate, letting it go, and then masturbating again actually leads to a fuller body orgasm as one would experience, say, from stimulating the G-spot, I guess I don't know. I guess I haven't heard that delaying it is going to make it more powerful. But I will say for men, again, what you can do is if you masturbate for a prolonged period of time, you're moving that machinery inside. The sperm is being kind of pushed further towards the ejaculatory duct, towards orgasm. And so the longer you do that, you can, in some regards, build up a larger ejaculate. So that is, you can get more aroused than you otherwise would be. So you can experience a much more, in some ways, a much more intense orgasm through prolonged kind of stimulation and masturbation. So there's that. Yes, you can kind of experience that more intense version, but I think that's a little bit different from kind of, say, clitoral versus full body kind of internal G-spot orgasm. That's another distinction that people make. And that's, again, I think that's something that sexuality researchers don't really understand themselves. I think people experience it, but it's difficult to reliably trigger one versus the other. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that. Where else would you get to talk about this stuff? We got 15 minutes left. Let's use this time. Questions about anything? What I would like you to know from this article, and again, there's always the possibility that something about this article will be on the midterm or the final exam. They've done research looking at how hormones do influence relationship functioning, and it seems to. Now, I will say that some of the research on what kinds of changes happen across the menstrual cycle, within science, to really be able to hold on to something as probably true, it has to replicate. You not only have to show it once, but you have to show it again and again and again, and hopefully by using better and better methods. This right here, this article was published in 2020. I would say this is one of the most recently done articles on this topic, and probably one of the better well done ones. The fact that they tracked these relationships across time with a diary study, that they collected hormone samples from both individuals, not just women, which is typically what you see. I see these as kind of very good improvements on the design, and they're replicating many of the findings that have previously been shown. However, there are other studies that exist that have come out more recently that actually show that the menstrual cycle doesn't have much of an effect. So I think this is something that I want to say you should keep your eye on. Don't take this as wholesale evidence that this must be absolutely true. Rather, this research does exist. There is some evidence in favor of the fact that men's and women's people's sex hormones, the fluctuation of those sex hormones does affect their relationship quality across time. And so it's something to keep in mind. It's a factor that can contribute to your relationship quality, how you feel, your sexual satisfaction, your relationship satisfaction, etc. How often you experience conflict within a relationship, stuff like that. All right, other questions?
So it says in here under like the role of hormones subsection that sorry, I gotta find it really quick. It says estradiol is associated with increases in general sexual desire, and then progesterone is the opposite. So for people I've known that have like been on like hormone replacement therapy, this seems to be like the exact opposite. Generally, people who are on estradiol seem to have like zero sex drive, and people on progesterone seem to have a lot higher sex drive. So like, is that like, now granted, that's mostly, trans people. I don't really know a whole lot of people, like cis people who have gone on HRT, so I don't know if maybe that has something to do with it, but just from the people I've spoken to, it seems to be like the opposite in practice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard too much about that, but I would guess, and I'll say that it's a hard guess. I would guess that it has to do with kind of where you're starting from. So HRT is used certainly for transitioning, but also by women who are going through, say, menopause, who their ovaries are no longer producing the concentration of sex hormone that they did before. So I would expect that, say, if your baseline is that you are an older woman, you've gone through menopause, and now you are receiving HRT, what you're doing is you may have been accustomed to a certain concentration of estrogen, and now you've lost it, and then you're kind of trying to get that back, and that can lead to higher sexual arousal. Women who are going through menopause and receive HRT, they tend to experience, especially, again, higher estrogen, not as much progesterone, tend to experience, say, greater sexual satisfaction in general, not just necessarily higher sex drive, but just satisfaction with having sex. For individuals who are trans, say trans women who say perhaps were assigned the biological sex, say assigned to sex at birth of male, of being a man, what you're doing is you might actually be transitioning from a relatively higher baseline sex drive to one that is relatively lower if, say, you are transitioning into the kind of the female typical hormonal profile. For example, if men do on average tend to experience kind of they're kind of easier to sexually arouse, not necessarily that their sex drive is stronger, but they're easier to become aroused. Being given more estrogen, usually with transitioning, there are two things going on here. Not only are you receiving more estrogen, usually you're taking some kind of testosterone blocker. And I think that's another factor to consider, is that it might not be the extra estrogen that is creating, say, lower sex drive, but rather that testosterone or androgens are being blocked. So I think we'd have to tease those two things apart. If you're doing all of that at once, which is what you would do with HRT, then what's going to happen is, yeah, you're receiving estrogen, which might lead to, which you're receiving estrogen and you're blocking testosterone. So the output of all of that might feel my sex drive is lower, not necessarily because of the estrogen, but because of the androgens, of the testosterone. Now, whether progesterone, that's interesting to me, whether progesterone itself increases sex drive. I've actually never heard that. That's interesting to me. I don't know if you know more or kind of have heard more about that.
I don't know a ton of it. The people that I do know that have been on progesterone, I know through Twitter, so I don't really talk to them about that process in particular. And actually, I was talking with somebody about this before. That seems to be a much newer thing. Like generally, for a long time, people were prescribed like estradiol and spironolactone, and now it seems to be like they're also being prescribed progesterone, which was like not really that popular 5 or 6 years ago. Like it seems more popular in the past like 2 years or so. So
interesting. I guess that makes sense. Again, I don't know too much about what the reasoning for that would be, but my guess is to the degree that women do tend to have a higher profile of progesterone, especially in not necessarily across the menstrual cycle, but especially during that luteal phase, after ovulation. It could be that there are certain fluctuations in something that need to be accounted for by taking some amount of progesterone. That's worth looking into, though. I appreciate that. I might actually, because I hadn't heard that. I hadn't heard progesterone being used as part of HRT. But anyway, does that kind of get at your question? I think that there's an extra factor where people going through HRT who are trans are probably also going to be taking androgen blockers, and that's probably what's going to most directly affect sex drive. They're kind of starting from the baseline of male typical sex drive and then kind of working your way down from there, versus women who are in menopause, who are going through menopause and receive HRT. They might experience higher sex drive because you're starting from really just a lack of most sex hormones, and then you're experiencing more of them. The chemical change is a little bit different.
That particular thing kind of made me think about, I think one of the questions I had was it possible to, I guess, take a uterus from another person and put it into, someone else? I didn't put transgender into it, but that's kind of a good, kind of thing. I think it's possible, but it would go through a lot of, chemicals and, it would be a lot trying to get it going. I just didn't know if it was possible or not. I kind of think it is, but then again, I kind of don't. I don't know.
So they actually are experimenting with not uterus transplants, but artificial uteruses. And that is a thing. Right now, it's experimental and extremely expensive, and so you don't see it a lot. But it is a thing, to the extent that someone who is trans might actually want, not just say on the outside physiologically or in terms of how they express to the rest of the world, want to transition, but they may also actually want other aspects of that experience. And being able to get pregnant and give birth is and can be a part of a female typical social experience. So having that technology, I actually think, is a good thing, but we're really not quite there yet. But yeah, it does exist. And transplanting a uterus, I imagine, would not work because there is so much machinery there that to just kind of take a one that already exists, put it in a new person, I think there'd just be a lot of logistical challenges there. However, with these artificial uteruses, the idea is that there may not be fallopian tubes, there won't be ovaries, but you can at least have an artificial, essentially a chamber, where it goes through all the normal processes of it might grow an inner lining that an embryo can implant into. It might be able to develop placental tissue, which is going to be necessary for forming the umbilical cord that will eventually feed the child. It is possible. It's there. They're experimenting with it, but it's not very well developed right now. And it's because it is very, I mean, the uterus is a very, very complicated structure. And so to get everything correct, and especially for the placenta to form, which is supposed to be kind of that interface between the child and the mother, or the person who's housing that child and developing that child, to create that connection such that the mother's blood can actually get to the developing child, I think that's probably the biggest logistical challenge of doing artificial uteruses. But it does exist, and it is there. Yeah.
Wow. It sounds like it's very much complicated. And when
Yeah.
they do
Yeah.
make it a thing, congratulations, because that's a lot. That's a lot.
Right. And you know, I would love to talk about this maybe next time when we're talking about abortion, but there are some people who are very, very strongly against artificial uteruses. And what you often see is that it's other women, or just women in general, women who are against these artificial uteruses. We can try to talk about that next time, why we might not, why some people might be almost morally against that for one reason or another. But all right, we're out of time. One last thing I want to mention is that, so next week, in 2 weeks from now, your midterm is going to be due. So next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to administer the midterm to you. It's going to be take home. You're going to have 1 week to complete it and then turn it in. It's going to be all essay based, no multiple choice. It'll be written, but you'll have a week to do it. I will essentially give you a list of questions. There will be some that you must answer, and there will be a list of, I think, like 7 or 8 that you then will have to choose 4 to answer. So just a series of essay, short answer based questions about the content that we have covered up until now. All right. I'm sure you have many questions about that. Just realize you'll have a week to do it, and you'll essentially have all the questions in front of you, and you'll just have to write something about it. Yeah, just
so we're able to like list them out, not like write like a full essay, or do you want us to write like kind of like an essay like from like first paragraph, second paragraph to address each thing?
Each question will probably take about 2 to 3 paragraphs to answer, but they don't have to like weave from one into the next. They can just be listed.
Okay.
When is our next term paper due?
The term paper assignment, that is 3 weeks from now.
Okay.
Term paper assignment 3B. All right. Sorry to keep you late. Feel free to email me with questions if you have concerns. You'll have your midterm next week. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and I'll see you next time.